Hey everyone, and welcome to Seriously Risky Business, the podcast we do here at Risky Biz HQ, all about cyber policy and intelligence. My name is Patrick Gray. We'll be checking in with our policy and intelligence editor, Tom Uren, in just a minute, and we're going to talk through his newsletter this week, which you can subscribe to at risky.biz. Before we get started, we'd like to say a big thanks to the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation for supporting Tom's work with us here, and also to Lawfare Media for syndicating Tom's weekly column. And we do have a sponsor this week as well, which is Sublime Security. I'm actually an advisor with Sublime Security, so obviously I'm going to say they're awesome, but they really are. They're an email security platform, like a cloud email security platform. And really what they've done is just re-engineer and re-implement, a cloud-based email security platform that's much more contemporary, much more modern, much more flexible, and actually adapts to each environment that it's in. It's very, very good. So if you're actually on the hunt for an email security platform, you definitely need to check out Sublime Security. But Tom, thank you for joining me. Obviously, the big story this week is what we're calling Signalgate, where an editor from The Atlantic was dropped into a group chat where a military strike was being planned by senior Trump government officials. Obviously, this is bad for a number of reasons. Those sorts of discussions are supposed to take place on government systems, usually located within SCIFs. Now, since we spoke about it on the weekly show yesterday, there have been some developments in the story. We have confirmation that some of the participants in this group chat were using personal devices, which I'm not too surprised by. And also Jeffrey Goldberg, the Atlantic reporter or editor, has released the full content of everything that he saw on Signal, because this story's really blown up. I mean, the messages that we've seen, thankfully, didn't seem to involve cutting and pasting top secret documents into Signal, which is something. But there was absolutely reportable intelligence in that group chat, and it doesn't look any better. Nothing we've seen in the last 24 hours makes this less bad.
Yeah, so I guess my big picture takeaway from all of this is that it just never should have happened. So no one in that thread should be thinking that this is okay, that Signal is okay for these kinds of communications. And that kind of procedure, that way of thinking, means that these kinds of leaks are inevitable. So in a way, this is like the best possible outcome for the Trump admin, in that it ended up with a journalist and not in Foreign Intelligence Service.
Yeah, they didn't accidentally add someone from the Russian embassy. So, I mean, in that way, it's good.
Yeah. Like, that's the best possible spin you have. But it would have happened eventually. Now, they wouldn't necessarily have added the Russian embassy per se, but there would be a Foreign Intelligence Service who would get onto one of those devices, would have had access to this group chat and potentially many others. So the way that they were doing things was a security breach just waiting to happen.
Well, I mean, I'd go a step further. Actually, I've been talking about this with various people in the United States who are experienced in these matters, and they have said that, given the use of personal devices here, that one of those endpoints would be, I asked them, do you think one of them is compromised? And they said undoubtedly. So they consider everything in these Signal conversations already to be exposed to foreign intelligence services. And I don't think that's being hysterical. I think it's entirely accurate to say anything posted into these group chats is winding up with an FIS.
Yeah. So the group, I think it had 20, 30 members. And so when you sort of think of the chances of any individual device being compromised, I think it starts to add up. It's small for any individual device. Well, and you've got 20 participants, and they're using their mobile device, and often they're using the desktop client as well. So we could be talking 30 to 40 devices, really, that are the target set there, which is, funnily enough, this is why you use government devices in a SCIF, right? Like, that's the whole point. Yeah. So I think it's also that they're high priority targets. It's not 20 or 30 random people. There's this incredible tweet from Steve Witkoff, who is the US Middle East envoy, and he basically says, "It's all right, guys. Don't worry. I didn't have access because I was using my personal device and not a secure government device."
No, he said it the other way around, because he was in Moscow, right? Yep. So people are like, oh my God, he was doing this from Moscow. And he said, no, don't worry. I wasn't doing it in Moscow because I only had my government device with me, not my personal device, thus proving that the Signal conversation was taking place on his personal device. Like, how did he think this was better?
It's ludicrous. I spent several minutes just laughing about that. Like, that makes it, and that I think underlines that there's no understanding of why or what you should be doing to keep these things secure, these conversations secure. And the take-home message is you just shouldn't be having them on Signal in the first place. Now, Signal is good. It's probably got the best reputation, but there's just so many more ways that personal devices can be compromised compared to government secure systems. And a lot of it just boils down to we don't let government secure systems connect to the internet. And that's a big difference.
Yeah, it is a big difference. And how? Absolutely, that's a big difference. And when you look at some of the material here that was exposed, I mean, you're talking about... Now, Steve Hegseth has said, we were not putting war plans in there, but there is a description of the timing and sequence of events, the fact that F-18s were going to be used. I mean, if the Houthis were able to see this, they may have been able to mobilize their air defense to certain areas because they would have, they would anticipate this attack, and it may have actually endangered US forces. So it is a very big deal. There's rumours kicking off at the moment in DC about possible resignations. By the time we've even finished editing this podcast, there may have been resignations. Surprisingly, and we covered this yesterday, Trump seems to be not so impressed with his people on this. He actually seems to understand that this is not cool, which almost surprised me because his normal response is just to attack everyone. But you still feel like the right lessons are not really being learned here, and that the focus out of the Trump camp has really been about saying that this journalist is a sneaky devil who wound up in this group chat, and not really, they haven't really copped most of the people involved, Trump excluded. Let's be fair to him. Most of the people involved in this seem to be not really, reevaluating their choices, let's say.
I feel like having a strong security mindset, it is a mindset. And if you're even in this situation, you're not thinking that way. And I think you learn a tactical lesson, which is don't use Signal, rather than actually sort of incorporating
a philosophical
it into
lesson.
Yeah, that's right. That's what I feel. So that group chat had the Director of National Intelligence, the Director of the CIA, Trump's National Security Advisor, and as far as we know, not one of them said, hey, it might be a good idea to have this conversation somewhere else. And that, just to me, is kind of mind-blowing. And rather than saying, yes, we made a mistake, there was probably just a bit too much, we put a bit too much detail in those conversations, which I think you could, that's at least an argument. No one's made that argument. They've just said...
It's at least an argument. It's not a good one, but it's an argument, right? Yeah.
Yeah. And they're saying, well, Hegseth has the declassification authority, so it's okay because...
By talking about it in an insecure way, he declassified it, right?
That's right, exactly. It's kind of like, what's the word? When you put the wagons together, forming a...
Circling the wagons.
Circling the wagons.
That's what you're after.
That's the American analogy that I'm unfamiliar with. And instead of just saying, yeah, okay, we need to re-examine how we communicate, we shouldn't have had those wagons out there in the first place, I guess.
Yeah, now, obviously, we've mentioned this on the show previously, but you worked in government service for a long time. You worked in the intelligence community. You have reacted like everybody else I know who's former IC, which is just to laugh their head off about this because it's so bad. I mean, I think there is a disconnect in the way this is being covered. In the sense that people who really know this stuff are just sort of horrified and kind of oddly amused because it's just so bizarre that they keep laughing about it. Whereas, I think a lot of people in the public don't necessarily understand that the issue here is the existence of these sorts of group chats in the first place, not the fact that one was exposed. That said, I feel like the media's done a pretty good job covering this, right, and honing in on what the issues are.
Yeah, I don't think it's Signal was never an answer to the kind of problems that they're having. The problem is we want to discuss things in real time, and having a fairly open discussion on Signal is just not the answer. I think the Biden administration reportedly they would use Signal to say things like, hey, you should go to a secure system and we'll have a chat there. That seems like a reasonable way to do it. I think you could also have said, Hegseth could have said, yes, all systems are go and we'll have more information later. That, I think,
Not
would be a reasonable
F-18s
message.
are about to take off. Weather looks good.
Exactly.
Like,
And
man.
then they subsequently talk about particular targets and whether they've killed them or not. I don't think that's appropriate for Signal.
Well, and they also exposed the fact that they had CIA folks on the ground who were spotting and things like that. Like they did give up information they shouldn't have. Anyway, look, we've talked heaps about this on the main show. We've talked about it now. If people want to read in more detail Tom's take, head over to risky.biz and read Seriously Risky Business. I've read it. It's a very good piece of analysis, and I'd recommend you all check it out. You did cover something else this week, which is the CSRB. And about how it deserves a rerun. It deserves to be spun back up because it was essentially disbanded in the very early stages of the Trump admin. There's been this letter circulating, though, from some committee member talking about CSRB and talking about how we need an inquiry to make sure that it matched the original intent as Biden expressed it and that it lived up to its vision and blah, 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 blah. Now, you're saying, I mean, I've read that letter as well. I mean, it seems pretty reasonable stuff. But your argument here is that, like, let's not slow it down. CSRB is unquestionably good. Let's just get it back up and running and then worry about fine-tuning it later.
Yeah. So the letters from the chair of the House Homeland Security Subcommittee on Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Protection, Andrew Garabino. So the main thing I have a problem with is he says we should review the CSRB, make sure that it's fit for purpose, and then get it back going. And I say, no, the CSRB is not perfect. It could definitely be better. He identifies like transparency, how the committee's made up, how you select incidents to review, and how you come to recommendations. Like, fair enough. Those are all things that I think are a bit undefined, or were a bit undefined in the previous operation of the board. However, I think that it has proven that it's done good reports, and Garabino also compares it to the NTSB, and he says it's not as well structured and defined as the NTSB. And I think that's just not the way cybersecurity is. So when I look back at the previous CSRB reports, and like the very, very high level summary, it just basically boiled down to massive problems. Like, supply chain security is underdone. So that was the Log4j report. Lapsus, my sort of high-level summary is current cybersecurity practices just are ineffective against a new breed of hackers. And the Microsoft report is Microsoft security culture sucks. And so it's not like the NTSB where you can say, these bolts on this plane were not tightened. Manufacturers, go and make sure that those bolts are tightened and report.
Yeah, I mean, it's a much smaller supply chain, you know, isn't it? When you're talking about like aircraft manufacturers, there's not as many of them as like software vendors, and you know, it's a different thing.
And you can trace back faults to very, very specific things, whereas the kind of like big picture problems are still huge. And so I don't think that there is a way that you can cut and paste from the NTSB to get to a CSRB that would work today. And so I think it's like you've got to learn by doing. You've got to move fast and break things, I guess, which seems to be...
Well, I mean, it sounds like really ultimately what you're saying is it was a mistake to disband it.
Yeah, so I think there's big problems like the Salt Typhoon compromise of US telcos, which, as far as I can tell, is still ongoing. And the CSRB was in the midst, or just starting to kick off its review of that. I think it's a real shame that it got interrupted. I'd like to see it running back as soon as possible. And waiting to try and make it perfect is not the right way to do that.
Perfect is the enemy of good. You heard it here first.
Exactly.
All right, we're going to wrap it up there. Tom Uren, thank you so much for joining me to walk through your newsletter this week. Again, anyone wants to subscribe to that, head over to risky.biz where you can get it in your inbox every week. Pleasure to chat to you as always, mate, and we'll do it all again next week. Cheers.
Thanks, Patrick.